Sri Aurobindo is describing the training of the power of concentration and its role in the yoga, and in what way we understand it differently in the integral yoga, as also in the culmination of the concentration, the state of samadhi. We have now reviewed what it means for the integral yoga, and we see in it not a withdrawal from the world and immersion into some beyond, but a settled existence in the one and infinite, united with it, identified with it, which state can remain whether we are in our exterior waking consciousness or an inner, subtler, indrawn state, or even if we withdraw to some kind of transcendence. The nature of the concentration also, while we use the singular focus of the mind to point our attention in the direction of the one source, the divine, that is worth knowing, the intention is to break through the level of the mind and to touch something above mind, on the basis of which the whole poise of concentration can change, and it can become similar to the concentration, the creative concentration of the divine, a single movement that turns to the whole without needing to separately focus in separate acts of will. And to be able to arrive at this settled divine status should be the goal of the concentration thereafter. If we think of this practically, it means that in whatever we do, we have to hold in ourselves first the idea of the one and the infinite. And as we turn our attention to this sense of oneness, to the infinity of this oneness, we keep a general awareness turned to it in the midst of all activities. As a result of this sustained state of concentration, gradually, in some part, we begin to feel ourselves identified with it. Eventually, more and more of us is drawn into that awareness, and eventually it is as if that awareness permeates us, fills all of us in all the levels of our awareness, and we are as if always a drop in an ocean of oneness which is infinite, on some level, to whatever degree, identified with that oneness and the infinity, even while in action in the midst of any finite, specific frontal focus. In a sense, this could be described as a state which we all tend to experience, however partially, when we are obsessed with something. An idea catches our fancy, or we fall in love and we are obsessed with the one special person or thing, and somewhere at the back of the mind always this thing exists and becomes as if a reference for everything that we do. I have shared an incident here which I found to be very practical, approaching this experience more from the heart and the bhakti. It was when I went to Gujarat. I had met the head of a traditional ashram, a semi-traditional ashram, and he was happy to know that I was coming from the ashram, from Sri Aurobindo's ashram, and he said, I have been there once and I learned a great lesson. And he narrated how, on his visit here, he was taken around by a Gujarati devotee. He was shown everything. He said he was very impressed with all the activities. But one thing he could not understand, because in his tradition, you are not doing the sadhana unless you are serving the Guru. And he said, I see everybody working. They're doing wonderful work. They're in a wonderful state. But how is this sadhana? Because your Guru is sitting in her room upstairs. So the Gujarati sadhak who was taking him around said to him, Do you know what it feels like to have fallen in love? And the man said, oh yes, I've experienced it. So the sadhak explained, all of us here in the ashram have fallen in love with the Divine Mother. And as a result, whatever we may be doing, we're always thinking of her, seeing her before us, feeling her in our heart, and all of our being is turned only towards her in the midst of our activity. And so this guru of that lineage, he said to me, then I understood how the sadhana works in your ashram. And he said it was a great lesson for him. But something of that is implied in this approach which we have been discussing. It is the reason why Sri Aurobindo, in his example for the practice of concentration, also takes up the example of concentrating on the divine love and the idea of God as love, and he elaborates on how that is to be practiced, because this is one of the ways which is most effective in uniting the focus of the mind and the heart. And when the two are held in the midst of work, then even the action is turned to the divine as the beloved. In the practice of concentration, we have seen three methods which Sri Aurobindo suggests for attaining to this settled divine status. The first is a kind of a strenuous concentration where we may follow an intellectual process of thought around a certain conception, and the idea should be more and more to focus on the essence of that, the essence of the idea of God as love, and gradually through this concentration, the various facets of the divine love should rise luminously to the mind, to the thought, to the heart, and to the whole being and the vision. At first, there may be the thought, and the experience comes afterwards. Otherwise, the experience comes, and then the knowledge rises out of it. And as we dwell on it and hold it, it becomes more and more a constant experience, and finally becomes the law of the being. This is the first practice. The second practice, he says, fixing the whole mind in concentration on the essence of the idea only, to as if get to the thing, and as a result of that intense concentration, thought ceases and passes into the absorbed or ecstatic contemplation of the object by merging into it and into a kind of an inner samadhi. But if there is a kind of a samadhi-like state, then later one has to bring down that state, that experience, let its light and power and bliss fill our ordinary consciousness, so that it is continuously established in the whole being. And the third method, which we have read and partly discussed, the last paragraph of which remains for elaboration, is not to concentrate strenuously, but first to still the mind altogether. We may use different methods, standing back and watching till the mind falls silent, or actively reject thought suggestions. You will notice whenever Sri Aurobindo gives a method of practice, anywhere in any text, the method always has two facets. There is a passive approach and there is an active approach. And the two are as if complementary because they engage two different sides of our nature. Eventually, it's as if the two methods merge into each other. So here also, in quieting the mind, the standing back, disengaging, not participating in the thought, is the passive approach, and the active rejection of the thought suggestions is the active approach. So, as a result of this, we as if lean back and hold on to the peace of the being, which is really and all the trouble and riot of the mind. And when this secret peace is unveiled, a great calm settles on the being, and there comes usually with it the perception and experience of the all-pervading silent Brahman. And on the basis of this calm, everything else may be built up in the knowledge and experience of the deeper truths of the divine. This is as far as we had read through in the last paragraph, which we have only briefly read. He takes this process now to its culmination, and there are many important aspects of the practice which are referred to, and some of them elaborated elsewhere. He says, ordinarily, once this state is obtained, strenuous concentration will be found no longer necessary. Now, once you have the sense of a pervading presence, the presence itself is so vivid, one may even turn the attention to simply the awareness of this presence, And all the forms are as if things floating in the ocean of the silence or the peace or the presence. Or one may have the vividness of the divine energy which fills this space as a dynamic, active, light, power, delight, bliss. Whatever form it is, when we turn to that more than things of forms, that immersion itself is the concentration. But your attention is not on a particular thought or form at any point. It is on this wide oneness, infinite, in whatever aspect of itself that it first reveals itself to you. So a strenuous concentration will be found no longer necessary. Instead, what happens? A free concentration of will, using thought merely for suggestion, and the giving of light to the lower members will take its place. There is still a role for the thought, but the role is now very different. The will itself is a kind of a free, wide awareness, intention, will, but now very free because it can turn to anything, focus on anything without losing the overall sense of awareness. And at any point when you concentrate, it is as if this widened awareness is pointing or narrowing its rays for a special focus. The widened awareness is never lost. It is as if at worst recedes into the backdrop, while on the front there is a narrowing and a special focus. So if, for example, one is walking in a kind of a walking meditation in the forest, on the beach, on the road, wherever it may be, you're aware of this immensity, this oneness, vastness as you walk. And then perhaps a flower, an animal, or another person greets you. Your attention turns to that. It is as if a focusing, a narrowing of the front. You may even engage in conversation, but the moment the conversation ceases, it's as if this attention leans back and reverts to the whole which was always there and never lost. So the will intention also similarly is a kind of a narrowing front of an awareness and even a will which is generally turned, but now it takes a special focus, using thought merely for suggestion and the giving of light to the lower members. Suppose as you walk, you find the ground is a little stony. There is a tendency for the foot to trip or to step on sharp points. Your attention turns to the feet, and it's as if you will into the feet a correction in the way you walk. Rather than walking smoothly as you would before, you place your feet more carefully in a slightly different rhythm and pattern. It puts that intention, and then again the thought settles back in this kind of a samadhi, and the feet follow the new corrected method. This is a very simple correction which we often do even without this kind of a state of awareness. Even if we are walking or we are running in a hurry and we find the floor is slippery, the mind turns briefly, there is a correction, and that's it. We don't need to pay attention again because the feet have been trained for this new pattern of walking in the past as we have grown up. But at that moment, the mind turns, puts a certain suggestion, and he says, giving light to the lower members. The light may initially be the mind's light, the mind's awareness which is imprinted. As when you're learning to play an instrument, your fingers don't quite act the way they should, and you infuse your attention into the fingers, will into the fingers a new way of movement, And imprinting that, the mind can disengage as the fingers now follow the new pattern. At that moment, the awareness infused is the light of the mental awareness which has been imprinted with a particular suggestion. This little finger is always lagging when I hit the piano key. I have to push it a little faster. And once I've done it a few times, the imprint is there, the correction is made. A similar process now will operate on any part of our being. So, for example, I find my body is a little sluggish. I am feeling a little tired, and I don't wish to be tired, or the tiredness is not acceptable in the present circumstances. So the mind turns in awareness to the energies, the body, and gently, it's a concentration, but a general turn lifts the awareness, turns the awareness, increases the energy. And that's the mental suggestion, to increase the energy, and the mental light which brings the awareness and imprints to make the correction. And then the attention can turn away. You have shifted your state already. When this process of change of consciousness proceeds to still higher levels, let's say now, as a result of this heightening of the consciousness, the opening to something above mind, there is a descent of something higher, a light, a force, the divine presence. These, as they fill the mind, become now the nature of the light which the mind brings into those other parts. Now, instead of the mind's light filling the hands to make the correction, it is that higher light which has filled the mind, which now fills the hands and makes the correction, or fills the body, or wills itself on a part of the body, let's say, which is sick. It needs to heal faster. There's a mental suggestion, but the nature of the light that comes is now of a higher kind. We may even, as this facility becomes more easy, we may consciously call down a higher light, direct it into that part which is unwell, to speed up the healing or to reduce the pain or whatever correction is required. So this description is a general description which applies even as the consciousness opens to a higher light, but also as the nature of the will undergoes a change. So here he only says a free concentration of the will, but there's a footnote. This subject will be dealt with more in detail when we come to the yoga of self-perfection. So we will see those passages in the yoga of self-perfection where he describes how the will itself undergoes a change. But we see two things: the will using thought for suggestion and giving of light to the lower members. The will change, and the nature of the light which the thought places will also change. He continues, this will then insist on the physical being, the vital existence, the heart and the mind remolding themselves in the forms of the divine, which reveal themselves out of the silent Brahman. So it's the will turns to the body, the vital and the emotional and the mind to be reshaped. Now he's making a very general statement, the elaboration of which involves several chapters in the yoga of self-perfection later. Which part of the physical being, which part of the vital existence, which part of the emotions, which parts of the mind, in what way are they to be made more conscious, what is to be overcome in each of them, in what way mixtures are to be separated among them, and so on. But the method used will still be the same, the will turning in a free concentration, using the thought as a suggestion and to fill light into those parts to make that change. This process described is extremely important, and it is essentially the process used for all self-development and correction and change subsequently. But the process still is in the hands of our conscious mentality. This point of the center from which the process of the will and the light is applied will subsequently open to something higher, at first act as a bridge to the lower action of something descending from above, and eventually it will arise into a higher state of consciousness, where the will and the knowledge will gradually unite more and more, all the way into a single action from the supramental consciousness, where knowledge and will are a single action. But the principle will still remain the same throughout. And the result of this remolding things, he uses another important idea, remolding themselves in the forms of the divine, which reveal themselves out of the silent Brahman. We have already certain very clear ideas of what would be the divine form of the emotional being, of the working of our mind, perhaps even of how the life energies should act, or to some extent of how the body should behave under the influence of or as an expression of the divine consciousness. These are things which have formed in our minds, sometimes from our reading, sometimes from examples shown to us. But deep within us already, we had certain idealistic impressions of how things should be. We feel intuitively that we should be capable of knowing whatever we want to know. We should be capable of doing whatever we want to do. We should be able to be in harmony with all things, all people, in all circumstances, etc. These are the ideals which often drive our efforts in life, at least in the early idealistic phase, before some kind of cynicism tends to color or cover these things. But where did these ideals come from? Somewhere within us already, a part knows. It knows what must be. But that knowing reflects through so many layers that in the outer form in which we conceive of it, there are often errors. Our idea of a perfectly organized society is something so flat that if we conceive of it, actually, we look at it and say, that's going to be boring life. You will lose interest. It's going to be too flat. I don't want it to be like that. So we are not able somehow to translate what we feel, a perfect harmony. When we bring it into the surface, the mind and the emotions shape it within their limited capability of understanding or experience. And that is, of course, boring. The true harmony of the divine character is full of newness, freshness, surprises, and opportunities, even challenges to overcome. And yet they exist in a state of continuous and a dynamic harmony, not a static harmony. We can get glimpses of this intuitively, but the full visualization of it is not possible to these parts because they just don't know what that is like. They're incapable of knowing it. But in this awareness of the silent Brahman, gradually, and especially when the divine presence begins to act more and more freely, glimpses emerge. One feels spontaneously, one knows intuitively, and those are the forms of the divine which reveal themselves. And the moment we feel, oh, this is how it should be, it is as if a part of us experiences the truth of it, and at that point to catch it, to imprint it in ourselves, to will our mind, emotions, energies, or body into the mold of that which we have already felt to be real and true, living experience. To mold ourselves into it becomes easy, almost spontaneous. But still there has to be an effort and intention. You will recall in the little booklet, The Mother, Sri Aurobindo refers to the importance of the personal effort in the initial stages especially, and he says, and I read now from that text, in proportion as the surrender and self-consecration progress, the sadhaka becomes conscious of the divine Shakti doing the sadhana, pouring into him more and more of herself, founding in him the freedom and perfection of the divine nature. The more this conscious process replaces his own effort, the more rapid and true becomes his progress. But it cannot completely replace the necessity of personal effort until the surrender and consecration are pure and complete from top to bottom. Note that a tamasic surrender, refusing to fulfill the conditions and calling on God to do everything and save one all the trouble and struggle, is a deception and does not lead to freedom and perfection. So in this text, you're seeing this gradual transition of the divine Shakti filling, supporting, and eventually replacing the sense of separate personal effort. But the process is essentially what is being described here. In other words, that there is a remolding of ourselves by a will intending along the lines of the forms of the divine which reveal themselves. And eventually, as it describes this, it culminates in the text which we have just read. By swifter or slower degrees, according to the previous preparation and purification of the members, they will be obliged, with more or less struggle, to obey the law of the will and its thought suggestion, so that eventually the knowledge of the divine takes possession of our consciousness on all its planes, and the image of the divine is formed in our human existence, even as it was done by the old Vedic sadhakas. So there are three important ideas. So swifter or slower degrees according to previous preparation and purification of the members, this change will be compelled on our parts. What is that previous purification and preparation? That's the part discussion of the chapters earlier, the purified understanding, and various other chapters involving the nature of the sadhana, of surrender in works, and so on. But to the extent that the levels of consciousness have been suitably separated from their mixture and made still, open, and receptive, that would be the most important part of the purification and preparation. There will be a rapidity in the change. And he says they will be obliged with more or less struggle to obey the law of the will and its thought suggestion. When the mind wills itself on the lower members, for example, you will your hand to bend. Initially, as a child, we will ourselves to learn to walk. We will ourselves to maintain balance. Observe what's happening when we are doing that. The body is doing something and losing balance. But in the child is the instinct to somehow will the balance on. When you will the balance on your body, you are not thinking in detail, each time I lift my right hand, my center of gravity will shift, so I should balance it by lifting my left hand or by bending from my waist to bring back the center of gravity. You don't think in this way. You put a general feel, a will on the overall feel of the body, that the moment it feels somehow unsteady, you will it into steadiness, and the body translates that will into the correct action. When you're learning to cycle, this is the biggest difficulty for someone who begins cycling. When you start falling to the right, the first instinct of the hands, not of the body, the first instinct of the hands under control of the mind is to turn the handle the other way. If I start falling right to the left, but that makes it worse, you fall harder. When you let go of the mind's intervention and let the hands flow with the rest of the body, as you begin to fall to the right, your hands swing the handle to the right, and that makes you recover the balance. And after a while, you find you let the handles swing with the body. As you cycle, the legs move left and right, your whole body leans left and right, your handles also swing left and right with the body. And that keeps the balance automatically. The body knows how to bring it into balance if the mind didn't interfere. Something of this innate capacity of correction and growth is triggered by the mind's general willing. So the thought suggestion puts the intention to hold the balance. The will is holding the balance, holding that intention to hold the balance, and the body is compelled to act, to respond. The same thing for the vital energies, for the emotions, and even for the mind. They will be obliged with more or less struggle. So there may be a passage of struggle. There's a response, but not enough. There's a response, but which quickly loses its right balance, its right direction. Again, you put a fresh impulse of will, and so on. You notice that's exactly how we train any skill of the body. But the same thing we can apply also to train our emotional responses, our energetic ties and entanglements with people and with circumstances, or even with our habits of thought. If there is, for example, a tendency in the mind to be pessimistic, first of all, you must recognize that there is such a tendency. Mostly we go on the defensive. If someone says, why are you so pessimistic? I'm not pessimistic. I'm only practical. I'm realistic. But you have to recognize, you have to be able to stand back and recognize, yes, there is a tendency. I don't like to face it, so I will dilute it further. There's a slight tendency, and I can correct it. Even that is a good start. And then how do you correct it? You put a will on the mind to turn it like you would turn the handle of the bicycle. You turn the body's center of balance. Turn it towards the positive thought. Turn your thought to thinking positive things, to looking at the world in a positive way. There are many variations to it. You can either force the form of the thought, actively give it a positive turn, or in your mind, if you can sense the undercurrent which makes it pessimistic, you can just turn it like that and make it positive. Everything is so beautiful. Just like that. Will yourself into seeing the world as a beautiful place. A similar thing you could do with the emotions and the habits of the emotions. You have perhaps a tendency to be quickly reactive to opposition or criticism. And so I will into my emotional being a relaxation. I relax the emotions, relax my heart, and in the energy with which I engage with this situation or with this person, I bring a state of relaxation. So now when the pressure comes, I'm more equal, more relaxed. I don't rush into a reaction. And all of this would be tied to various limbs of the integral yoga proper, the yoga of self-perfection, which I describe later, establishing an equality in all the parts of the being, increasing the energy in all the parts of the being, and so on. All of these would be taken up by this process. We're doing it in the body. In any case, we extend now the process to all the other parts. It requires, though, some time, some effort of self-observation. And this is where the exercise that the mother has recommended becomes so effective. That every evening before sleeping, you pause, sit for a while, review the whole day as if observing the life of a third person, not identifying with it. Observe the points which need modification and correction. Observe where your behavior was not to your reference of what it should be, and then imprint your will on those parts, shape into them, those parts, the new rhythm, the new response, the new way of being, and then at the end, offer the whole day and go to sleep. The exercise becomes especially effective when you do it before sleeping, because whatever suggestions of the mind, whatever light of the consciousness you have brought into those parts and the will, leaves as if a suggestion which sinks deep into the subconscious during the night sleep. Because just after placing the suggestion, there is nothing else to neutralize that suggestion. If I've put a suggestion now and then I enter a different activity, very likely the habits of the new activity will override the suggestion which I have placed. Or the force of the suggestion is diluted because that energy is now taken up for something else. But when we have done it just before sleeping, these suggestions go very deep inside. They have time to, if I may use the word, to pickle, as if the process which takes place in pickling, where it soaks in the juice and changes from inside out. So the light, the will settles in those parts, soaking in the work from within. And the next day you find almost spontaneously the things you had willed are now tending to happen, or even happening already easily, depending on the previous preparation and purification of the members. So with more or less struggle, they are obliged to obey the law of the will and its thought suggestion. So that, and now this progression goes up to where? Eventually, the knowledge of the divine takes possession of our consciousness on all its planes, and the image of the divine is formed in our existence, in our human existence. So, as you're doing this, the light, the awareness of the thing to which we have already connected, a higher consciousness, is infusing itself. But there's an awareness which grows as you turn and become aware of these things within you. As you will things within you, you also begin to feel these parts. But under the influence of a higher light, of a higher divine image, that begins to fill the consciousness, and the image of the divine is formed in our human existence. This is a very important idea, and its full understanding we have only when we see, even as it was done by the old Vedic sadhakas. What did the old Vedic sadhakas do? What is this image of the divine formed in our human existence? You will see this is a point where the process of the integral yoga is very similar to, almost identical to, very similar to the Vedic process, but using a very different method. In the Vedic yoga, all the powers of the divine were seen not only as powers of the divine consciousness, but as conscious beings in themselves. The mind, as a universal mind, as a cosmic mind, which forms the mental idea of the universe, upon which the life energies fill to flow, and through which the forms of matter are finally cast. That presiding universal mind consciousness is conscious as a being, as a power of God put out into manifestation. And as a being, it is a cosmic being presiding over all the mental formations of the universe. Because he wills those forms take place in the mental world and reflect in the vital energies and eventually form the physical. And this domain of this ruler, of this mind deity, is a domain in itself of which he is the king. His powers of formation themselves are several, and they are as if his aspects or secondary powers. And to this, we give a name. In the Veda, he is called Indra. When you relate to this consciousness in its universal function, you can ask his help. You can say, enlighten my mind, free my mind from its narrowness and limitation, and make me experience your universal cosmic mind consciousness. So you can ask him for help instead of asking the divine supreme or the divine Shakti. You can ask him for help because he is the Lord of this mind. He can do what he wants. Your mind is a part of his territory, his domain. But when he begins to act, there are conditions. Because he represents the mind consciousness, he lives by the laws of the mind consciousness, and so you have to fulfill his conditions. His conditions in which he will act in your mind and change it, fill it with light, and so on. Similarly, the life energies which pour through are also a deity in themselves, or the part of the life energies which are just below the mind, which are the maruts. They form the thought suggestions coming from the life sensations. They too have their place. They are many, they are scattered. They tend to be in chaos. It is Indra who brings the maruts together, aligns them to form a coherent thought. And he holds the center of the thought with the self-awareness of the intelligence, organizing the thought impulses into clarity, structure, logic, harmony. So it is Indra who can overcome the maruts and the chaotic thought impressions rising out from my emotions and sensations into the mind. So I pray to Indra, I invoke Indra to establish his rule in my mind, to form himself, to settle in my mind as the ruler of the mind and establish his kingdom, to raise my mind out of its current state of darkness, twilight, into the illumination of his heavenly realm of light, and bring the maruts in order, organize them, put them in harmony within me. And the result is, as his rule is established, Indra also rules in the physical representation, the lightning and the thunder. He illuminates my mind with the lightnings of the intuitions, and so on. And so the whole journey of the yoga itself is as if a constant interchange between the gods and the human beings, in which we offer to them ourselves, of course, with those conditions. And so a purified instrument is offered to them, and they in turn form themselves in us, organize their powers in us, and establish their rule within our consciousness. The result of this double exchange is the transformation of the human nature into the divine nature. Eventually, though, all the gods organize their different functions in different parts of our being, and you have still one last challenge left. Each is possessive of its territory, its domain, its rules, its laws, its principles. And they don't see eye to eye because they're different aspects, different powers of the divine, ruled by different principles. So at the last stage of the whole Vedic yogic process, there has to be the harmonization of all these. And you have actually to disengage from their personal engagement and complete the unification in the highest divine consciousness. So first you ask them for help, but eventually you have to overpass them to something greater than them. This is broadly, and perhaps in a very superficial way, the description of the Vedic approach to the yoga and the transformation of consciousness, because that was a very important part of the Vedic yoga. But you see how this idea later becomes the basis for all of the knowledge the sciences, the techniques of magic. If you observe the systems of magic in its fallen condition, in the Tantra, the means for acquiring powers, or in the various secret societies which involve the practice of magic, you will see the same idea applied, though with a very diluted and, I would say, fallen objective. In order to grow beyond my limitation, in order to acquire such and such a capacity or such and such a power, you have to appease such and such a deity who presides over that power. So you do perform this ritual which invokes that deity, fulfill the conditions which allows that deity to establish his or her influence in you, and you are granted with this power, this capacity. So you'll actually find books which are available which describe the sadhana, the particular practice necessary for appeasing various deities. And if you go into it in detail, you will see the whole system is so scientific. So, for example, in certain forms of magical practice, the deities addressed are, among others, the 7 planets. And so if you want to invoke the power of this particular planet, this is the color associated with this planet, this is the form, this is the sound, these are the materials associated with its vibrations, and so on. You surround yourself with those things in a particular way, as if to build an affinity, a resonance with that deity's vibrations. And then you go through certain forms of invocation. Sometimes you are given a certain formula. The formula itself may have been infused with a power by somebody under the influence of that deity, or it may be revealed by that deity to somebody, or free of formula, you simply call upon that deity, and so on. Again, there are certain body parts which resonate more closely with the deity, so in those parts you visualize, and so on. The end result is an invocation, a descent, and an identification, as a result of which there is a transformation. And that's it. But what we did it for was to acquire a power, was to gain some material benefit, and so on. And that's what makes it simply magic. The principle now applied to a higher goal and the highest consciousness is the method of the yoga of transformation, where we open ourselves, fulfilling the conditions, the aspirations, the rejection, and the surrender. We open ourselves to the highest divine consciousness that fills us, and the divine consciousness from its highest and the divine Shakti from the highest includes all facets, all powers, all aspects of itself. And as it settles, she forms within us whatever is needed at that moment to the best of our capacity, to the extent that we are able to handle and bear, and progressively molds us and establishes herself in us. And it is that establishing, transmuting and transforming the substance and the nature of our substance which makes it a transformation. So this process is the image of the divine formed in our human existence, even as it was done by the old Vedic sadhakas. But the big difference in the integral yoga is we do not address any of the intermediate forms, aspects, or deities. We relate ourselves directly to the divine Shakti and the Supreme Lord. And the divine Shakti does this work in us. So you see again, rereading that text which I read out from the Mother. In proportion as the surrender and self-consecration progress, the sadhaka becomes conscious of the divine Shakti doing the sadhana, pouring into him more and more of herself, founding in him the freedom and perfection of the divine nature. And this is really the process as it takes place in the integral yoga, because she handles all the powers. Again, later in the same text of the little booklet, The Mother, he says, if you desire this transformation, put yourself in the hands of the Mother and her powers without cavil or resistance, and let her do unhindered her work within you. 3 things you must have: consciousness, plasticity, unreserved surrender. Also in the same text, a little earlier, when he speaks of the 4 powers of the Mother, he says, for when her personalities are all gathered in her and manifested, and their separate working has been turned into a harmonious unity, and they rise in her to their supramental Godheads, then is the Mother revealed as the supramental Mahashakti, and brings pouring down her luminous transcendences from their ineffable ether. Then can human nature change into dynamic divine nature, because all the elemental lines of the supramental truth consciousness and truth force are strung together, and the harp of life is fitted for the rhythms of the eternal. So there is this weaving together of all the facets into a perfect harmony, which she does, and even as she is forming herself in us, she leads step by step, operating on many different things at the same time, always bringing them in greater and greater harmony. And that is why the other passage is so relevant, where he speaks of not attempting to follow and understand the working of the Divine Mother with our mind. He says, but be on your guard and do not try to understand and judge the Divine Mother by your little earthly mind that loves to subject even the things that are beyond it to its own norms and standards. I skip a little bit and it goes to, the human mind shut in the prison of its half-lit obscurity cannot follow the many-sided freedom of the steps of the Divine Shakti. The rapidity and complexity of her vision and action outrun its stumbling comprehension. The measures of her movement are not its measures. Bewildered by the swift alteration of her many different personalities, her making of rhythms and her breaking of rhythms, her accelerations of speed and her retardations, her varied ways of dealing with the problem of one and of another, her taking up and dropping, now of this line and now of that one, and her gathering of them together, it will not recognize the way of the supreme power when it is circling and sweeping upwards through the maze of the ignorance to a supernal light. So instead he says you should open and feel with the psychic nature and see with the psychic vision which knows the truth directly. And then she enlightens and reveals to us how she is working. But this description you will find is the way the Shakti works in us. It will take up a certain part of the development and then suddenly stop that and take up another part. And in that transition, we feel, oh, I was progressing so well the last few days, and now suddenly there is a reversal and something completely different has happened. I have as if lost all that. But what we don't realize is she took that as far as it would go. If it went further, it would create an instability. And now she turns attention to something else and leads this other development. Later, she will pick up the thread of the first and the second and join them, and many threads in this way. If we remain open from the deeper psychic sensitivity, we can sense that something has changed, some rhythm has modified itself, and we trust. And as long as we feel her light and force in us working, we don't worry too much. Also, this idea of making rhythms and breaking rhythms. We've got into a rhythm and now we feel, oh, everything is going fine. I just continue another few years from here and everything will be perfect. And suddenly the rhythm is broken. And that's because that rhythm would have locked us into a very limited harmony and prevented a more multifaceted, complete development or multifaceted experience even of the spirit. You will find in all of Sri Aurobindo's writings, when he discusses spiritual experiences, he describes all the facets of all the experiences, and even sometimes their further variations. Sometimes they are too numerous to describe, so he just gives you a general description. But where necessary, he describes all facets or the principles of those facets. And that's because he has experienced all of them. And it's the only teacher in the history of human spirituality who has actually experienced all the facets of all experiences and described them in such a detailed, compelling, convincing, and a rational framework. You see everything and it makes so much sense. But it comes from his experience. But that is the nature of the integral yoga that ideally we would want, depending on our temperament and our readiness and capacity, we would want the full spectrum of the experience of the divine to be included in the full development. Even if each spectrum is partly explored, at least it is known, and it is not a one-sided development by which we know only one facet of the divine. So this establishment of the divine knowledge taking possession of our consciousness and the image of the divine being formed is a multifaceted process in the integral yoga led by the divine Shakti. And so in conclusion he says, for the integral yoga, this is the most direct and powerful discipline. With this, the chapter on concentration is completed. The next chapter is an enunciation. But before we take that up, remember the footnote, a free concentration of will. And he says the subject will be dealt with more in detail when we come to the yoga of self-perfection. So we'll briefly take a look at that. The main dealing with the subject is in the chapter called Purification, Intelligence and Will. That is purification of intelligence and will. Subsequently, there is also an associated description in the way of equality and another description in the power of the instruments. Although they span, and we will read just brief portions across 3 chapters, you will find the idea is consistent and just a continuation and a development of what we have read. In the chapter titled Purification, Intelligence and Will, he's describing how the buddhi, the intelligence, the intellect is to be purified, and it has 2 facets. The intelligence as power, as a function proper, and then the willpower. That is why the buddhi he translates as intelligent will. He describes there how there is an ascent of the will in the lower levels of our consciousness, in the body, for example. The will is purely instinctive. You feel hunger. Where did it come from? You didn't choose it. It pushed itself forward. You ate food and the biological machinery kicks in, wills itself into process, does exactly what is needed. You're not even aware of what it's doing, why it's doing, how it's doing. So the will is completely subconscious. As we rise through the physical consciousness in evolution into the life energies and the emotions, we find there the will and the knowledge are somewhat mixed. Still, the will leads, the knowledge follows. I feel uncomfortable with this. I don't know why. The will has come forward. Later, as things unfold, I realize why. The knowledge has now caught up. But in the emotions, again, you find an instinctive pull, push, comfort, discomfort, attraction, repulsion. Where the will presides, the knowledge is hidden. As we rise through the emotions into mental self awareness, at that point, the knowledge begins to take over and precede the will. I understand I need to do this, and then I make an effort to do it. But because they're still two separate operations, I know what I have to do, but I'm too lazy to do it. Or I do something instinctively at that moment, I'm carried away, swayed by my fear or desire of the moment. And then the understanding, I know this is harmful for me. I know it's not good to eat too many sweets, but I can't help it now. So the willpower flags, the knowledge flags, the willpower presides. There are two different processes. As we rise still above, beyond the intelligence, beyond the buddhi, there is a higher intelligence which begins to operate, supramental, and he uses the word supramental as describing everything above the mind, in the higher ranges of the mind. And there, as we rise higher, the knowledge and the will begin to join into a single experience. So, for example, when you have a strong inspiration, a strong intuition, as let's say you've sat down to write poetry or paint something, when there is a strong inspiration, you know what it is that you're going to create. May not be in detail or form, but sometimes even vividly in detail. And with it comes also a drive, a rhythm in which the hand moves, the words speak, the fingers write, type, and the poem is formed, the painting is created. Sometimes as you write, you fully understand what it was that the intuition was revealing, but you had a sense of it already, at least in a sense of experience, what would take form. So the knowledge and the will are as if in a single movement pouring through you. And such is the final culmination in the supramental consciousness, where the knowledge and will are one, but also they are infinite. The will itself acts in a single movement on everything. The knowledge itself holds in a single gaze everything, all facets, all layers, all variations, and so on. So there's a bit of this description in the chapter. And then he says, and I read a portion from it, he's describing how the buddhi is to be purified and disengaged from the lower entanglement. All subjection of the buddhi to the sensations and impulses is an impurity. The thought and will have to stand back detached from desire, troubling emotion, distracting or mastering impulse, and to act in their own right until they can discover a greater guide, a will, capital W, tapas, capital T, or divine Shakti, which will take the place of desire and mental will and impulse. An ananda or pure delight of the spirit and an illumined spiritual knowledge which will express themselves in the action of that Shakti. So this is a key idea. The mental will is going to act until it can open to a still higher will, a still higher tapas or a divine Shakti. And you see now what is meant by the tapas, that concentration of the divine creative force by which it concentrates on the whole creation in a single movement. That's the nature of the divine will, and that's the way the divine Shakti acts. It's as if our individual will plug into that, become a link point through which that begins to fill us more and more and act through us, eventually replacing the sense of separate individual will by its constant inspiration. So this I leave. There are further description of the will, how the individual will opens to something higher, but I will skip that and go to the other chapter on titled The Way of Equality, where he describes briefly how the equality is, no, he describes in great detail first how the equality is to be established by the negative method, which is simply refusing to react at first and then gradually bringing a deeper and deeper freedom of equality. But then there is the other way, which is the positive method, which is while participating in activities, we see all things as having equal value from a higher poise, and we see all energies and actions as proceeding from one source and moving to one culmination, and so on, to bring an equality even in the active effort. And he discusses how this positive method works in the three great powers of knowledge, will, and feeling. And he describes how the feelings meet the world, how knowledge meets the world, and then how the will in us meets the world. And I'll read from that. It's a whole paragraph, but I will take a few selected lines. He says, the will in us, because it is the most generally forceful power of our being, takes many forms and returns various reactions to things, such as incapacity, limitation of power, mastery, or right will, wrong or perverted will, neutral volition, and others of the kind. But now there are two parenthetical statements here. When he says the most generally forceful power of our being, there is a parenthetical statement. There is a will of knowledge, a will of life, a will of emotion, a will acting in every part of our nature. But now he's taking the will generally. These two, the positive equality accepts as a tangle of provisional values from which it must start and which it must transform into universal mastery, into the will of the truth and the universal right, into the freedom of the divine will in action. And how this transition is to be made. The equal will need not feel remorse, sorrow, or discouragement over its stumblings. If these reactions occur in the habitual mentality, it will only see how far they indicate an imperfection and a thing to be corrected, and to get beyond them to a calm and equal guidance. It will see that these stumbling themselves are necessary to experience, and in the end, steps towards the goal. So this is the attitude which we have to bring in when we are developing this poise of the will in dealing with our own internal difficulties and their expression in circumstances. I'm reading this text for this reason, because it complements studying that we have to recognize, even when we make an effort, there's a failure, there's a stumbling, there is a distortion in the action. If there's a reaction within us, we take it only as something to be corrected. But if there's a stumbling, we accept that as necessary to the experience and as a step towards the goal. Behind and within all that occurs in ourselves and in the world, it will look for the divine meaning and the divine guidance. It will look beyond imposed limitations to the voluntary self-limitation of the universal power by which it regulates its steps and gradations, and go beyond to unity and the illimitable power of the divine. All energies and actions it will see as forces proceeding from the one existence, and their perversions as imperfections, inevitable in the developing movement, of powers that were needed for that movement. It will therefore have charity for all imperfections, even while pressing steadily towards a universal perfection. So each time we have a stumble, we have a problem, we have a failure, so-called, of our effort, of our nature, a fallback, a relapse, whatever it is, instead of blaming ourselves, oh, once again, how long will it happen? What can I do? I'm helpless. Human nature is too difficult. This yoga is too difficult. which don't help in any case. So, charity for all imperfections. Well, that's the substance with which we began. Who began? That divine energy willingly chose a limited starting point. So it was a choice we made, it made, whatever it is. And it started with this limitation. So obviously these problems are inevitable. We're going to stumble, we're going to make these mistakes, there will be errors. Okay. But each time we have that error, we have made one forward progress. We have understood things better. There's some growth. And these are the steps necessary. So there's an imperfection. Yeah, that's what we started with. I accepted that, if you want to make it personal, I accepted that when I entered this life, this world, this body, to experience this game and overcome my limitations and overcome the limitations of this substance. Okay. So charity for all imperfections, even while pressing steadily towards a universal perfection. And it helps to remind ourselves that from the poise from which we came and all this limitation came, we were free and capable of that perfection. We have entered a consciousness and a substance where somehow that capacity is not accessible anymore. But because essentially it is that, we are that, therefore it is inevitable. It's just a question of faster or slower, with detours or straight path. And that's to great extent even our choice. If I find in my nature, I feel myself distracted by this thing rather than going through the straight path which I would like in my highest ideal. And I'm attracted to these distractions and I go a little bit meandering. On some level, it's a choice made. A choice made even to accept the nature which is meandering, perhaps even a sanction of the soul to accept the meandering, which I, idealistic mental individual, am not conscious of. And the day the soul says enough of the meandering, it puts forward the strong feel enough. Suddenly I lose interest in those meanderings and I say, okay, I've wasted enough time. Let's get on with the real thing. So till then, at least in some part, the soul sanctioned or allowed that meandering because it found it interesting. And if somewhere deep within us, we feel that vibration of the psychic influence, in it, we can feel also the sense of eternity. We have eternity ahead of us. What's the hurry? As long as I enjoy the journey and I find it fulfilling in growth, it's fine. As long as I'm not using this as an excuse to indulge, I'm fine. So this equality will open the nature to the guidance of the divine and universal will, and make it ready for that supramental action in which the power of the soul in us luminously full of and one with the power of the Supreme Spirit. So again, this is it, as far as I find relevant for the text we studied. And the last one is from the chapter titled The Power of the Instruments, where he discusses how each of the different parts of our consciousness have to be heightened, enlarged, and rectified in their power of nature. And he lists one by one each of these parts and what kind of correction is required. So just quickly to give you an idea, he says, the first thing the will has to do with the body is to impose on it progressively a new habit of all its being, consciousness, force, and outward and inward action. It has to be taught an entire passivity in the hands, first of the higher instruments, but eventually in the hands of the spirit and its controlling and informing Shakti, and so on. What to do with the body. Then the control of the body and life by the mind, and it's all yoga implies the carrying of that control to a very high pitch. But afterwards, the mind must itself give place to the spirit, to the spiritual force, the supermind, and the supramental force. So I skip the rest of the paragraph. And the result of the change on the body he describes. Then the energy. He discusses what has to be done with the life energy. And I skip that. And then he discusses how the life prana not only supports the physical and vital, but also the mental and spiritual action. Therefore, the prana has to be liberated for the spiritual action. Then there is a psychic prana, not in the inmost psychic, but of the desire, emotional nature. And then the chitta has to be taken up, and it has to be, the corrections to be made for it. The faith in the heart. And then the last perfection is that of the intelligence and the thinking mind, buddhi. And after all that, he says, in the last paragraph of the chapter, the normal instruments thus perfected will act each in its own kind without undue interference from each other, and serve the unobstructed will of the Purusha in a harmonized totality of our natural being. This perfection must rise constantly in its capacity for action, the energy and force of its working, and a certain greatness of the scope of the total nature. So now it's as if all of the nature has been dealt with part by part, and now the whole thing is held together and its powers greatly amplified. They will then be ready for the transformation into their own supramental action, in which they will find a more absolute, unified, and luminous spiritual truth of the whole perfected nature. So from here to that highest perfection, how do we make the transition? It's as if all the parts now have been corrected, put in right place and right relation and amplified, and then we have to now lift the whole thing all the way to its highest. How is that to be done? And this is the part I want to read. The means of this perfection of the instruments we shall have to consider later on. But at present, it will be enough to say that the principal conditions are will, self-watching, and self-knowledge, and a constant practice, abhyasa, of self-modification and transformation. So you have an awareness, all these parts you become conscious of, you work to purify them, put them in the right relation, right place, and then there's a whole process of lifting the whole perfection of the instruments. The principal conditions are will, and this is this general will. You hold the whole of your nature in an awareness and will it to turn upwards, will it to become more conscious, will it to aspire, will it to open and to receive the action of the divine Shakti. So will, self-watching. So in this self-awareness, as you will, you notice certain things, you notice certain disharmonies, you notice certain limitations, and you're able to intervene, correct, by will. And then self-knowledge and constant practice. So you, as you become more aware, as you work on yourself, more and more layers and nuances come into your attention, into the domain of your attention, come into the light, so to say. Whatever you become conscious of, automatically now can be brought in the awareness of a higher influence, a higher light and force. As long as it was hidden and you were not conscious of it, the higher force had to work indirectly. The moment you become conscious, you bring into that awareness and you know this part more intimately. Your knowledge of yourself grows. So self-knowledge and a constant practice, abhyasa, of what? Self-modification and transformation. Little corrections, little tweakings, harmonizations, changes, pushing the envelope a little more and a little more, amplifying, raising, perfecting, adjusting, refining, purifying, willing, which is going on bit by bit. It's as if you had a complex machine with many different parts, and each of these parts is being tweaked and tuned and brought into harmony and raised and perfected, even transformed as you go along. And the whole thing is being gradually lifted up in one movement of self-modification and transformation. The Purusha, that is the consciousness within us which is making the effort, the Purusha has this capacity, for the spirit within can always change and perfect the working of its nature. But the mental being must open the way by a clear and watchful introspection and opening of itself to a searching and subtle self-knowledge which will give it the understanding and to an increasing extent the mastery of its natural instruments. A vigilant and insistent will of self-modification and self-transformation. For to that will the Prakriti must, with whatever difficulty and whatever initial or prolonged resistance, eventually respond. So this is again the action of the will. When you put that will for self-modification and self-transformation, the Prakriti must eventually respond. And an unfailing practice which will constantly reject all defect and perversion and replace it by a right state and a right and enhanced working. And this is the last line of that chapter. Ascesis, tapasya, patience and faithfulness and rectitude of knowledge and will are the things required until a greater power than our mental selves directly intervenes to effect a more easy and rapid transformation. That power will be discussed in the later chapter, the Divine Shakti. But you see here, as an initial effort, our mind's self-awareness, standing back, taking up the whole thing, putting upon it this persistent and insistent will, but then acting as a link point to something higher, which begins to fill and act through this will. Now, when you will something, it is not just your personal effort, but you bring consciously the connection to the higher force, you direct that force, imprint that suggestion, that idea into that part, and then let the force work. And you have the text which we read. I come back now to the chapter we are reading, where he says, a free concentration of will, using thought merely for suggestion and the giving of light to the lower members, takes place of the strenuous concentration. This is the method Sri Aurobindo himself subsequently used in his own yoga, and with which he worked for some pretty radical changes in his consciousness and in his body. The most physically radical that we could say, arguably, is the change of the shape of his body at the level of the skeletal structure. See, to change fat tissue is relatively easy. To change muscle tissue takes a little longer, but again can be done, if nothing else, just by exercise. But even in the exercise, it is the will and the intention imprinted which makes the real difference, not just the mechanical exercise. But to change the skeletal structure is extremely difficult. And Sri Aurobindo records in his diary notes, in the record of yoga, his effort to make this change. And in one of the letters, he describes several years later, 2 decades later, about that he successfully corrected or changed the shape of his waist and the bone structure, making the body slimmer by a persistent will on the body over a span of 6 to 7 years. Now, if you think about it, if we had to put a concentrated, strenuous will to make a change on the shape of the body for 6 years, it would not only be exhausting, but we wouldn't be able to do anything else. Obviously, that's not the kind of strenuous will he put, but it is this kind of a general relaxed will which he is describing here, Once that state is attained, strenuous concentration will be found no longer necessary. A free concentration of will using thought merely for suggestion and giving of light. That's the kind of will he used. You imprint on the body the shape, the form, the correction you want. So let's take it in more detail. Suppose now you have common problem, increase of the stomach size or increase of fat in certain parts of the body. Feel your body, feel those parts, especially in those parts, make it conscious. Now you will notice the places where fat accumulates are precisely the places where you are not conscious. That's why it accumulated. So you have to make it conscious. Massage, rubbing the surface of the skin is one way you trigger the process. And that's why massage is so effective. It makes the body conscious where you're rubbing or pressing. Or you're infusing consciousness also with your hands, with the energy. But just rubbing, infusing energy, but with that you try to feel inside, feel the tissue space, feel the body substance in that area. And then feeling the whole body in this way, imprint into your sensation of the body the shape you want. So reducing the stomach size, for example, feel what the body would be like when the stomach is as you want it to be. Feel that fat dissolving and taking a new shape, new form. Now this is not a thought, not a visualization, but a sensational feeling which you have to imprint in the body consciousness, because that's all the body knows. The body does not understand words. It does not understand thought pictures which are out there in the mental world. It understands only sensation in body tissue substance. It understands conviction of the body tissue substance. So you have to feel the conviction of that shape change. Now my body feels slimmer, younger, fresher, lighter. Feel that, actually imprint that feeling until you actually feel your body has become like this. And hold that intention. And then put the will, again generally the suggestion on the whole body. This is the form I must move into more and more. This is my real form. This is how it should become. You do this persistently for a few seconds or a few minutes every day. And then later during the day, if you are in an intense mode of sadhana, because you are doing other things at the same time, this suggestion, this idea may be recalled, revived, refreshed, so to say, in the feel of the body, in the intention. At least when you do your exercises, at least when you go for a walk or you work on the body in a particular way, even if otherwise your attention is turned to other things. And the result of it will be, within a few days sometimes, you will notice the body feels different. Within a few weeks, you will notice there is a correction in the shape or the weight and so on. I've mentioned how my teacher, when he was asked to reduce his weight after he had a mild heart attack, he did not change his diet in any significant way. We saw him to do only two things. When he was taking the rice, there was a bowl full of rice, he would deliberately remove a small part. Now the part was negligible, it would have made no difference. But it was as if imprinting the suggestion in the body, something to be reduced in its effect. And then he would weigh himself once a week. That was all. But that once a week was a ritual. He would take the weighing machine, stand. If at all there was a slight deviation of a half a kilo, immediately it was corrected the next week. Just the intention held on the body was enough to be able to hold the weight to whatever number he chose. And similarly, I think many of us would have experiences also. I will relate here one more example which comes from the domain of experimentation on muscle building. 3 groups were involved in this experiment. The first group is a control group, it does nothing. The second group is asked to exercise 1 hour every day. And the third group is asked to sit on a chair and visualize themselves doing the exercise 1 hour every day. And at the end of a month, the first group has no change. The second group, which did the actual exercise, they have put on a certain muscle mass. But the third group, which visualized themselves doing the exercise, have put on 30% of the muscle mass of the group which did the actual exercise. Easy, isn't it? You can sit on your chair and grow your muscles. But in the text I read of the study, they described that they had asked the people to visualize themselves doing the exercise. Now, what do most people do when you visualize yourself doing exercise? You picture someone out there doing it. Incidentally, if you notice somebody else carefully, somebody hurts their finger, you go, ouch, your fingers shrink. There's an identification and some kind of a transfer as you visualize someone out there exercising. But it would have been far more effective if they were asked to feel themselves rather than visualize. Feel themselves in the image doing the exercise. And at that point, you will feel lifting the weight, and the body receives the effect, that suggestion, the will, the intention, the result intended, and you would get far greater result than if you just visualized as a third-party picture. But even that has an effect because of the intention which was present there. So if you put a will in this way on any part of the body, any part of the emotions, life energies, and the mind, in this relaxed will intention placed, one can do enormous amount of work. All it needs is that sustained effort, not strenuous at all, but sustained in a relaxed way, even enjoying the experience, even if it is for a short duration every day, but repeated. So once in the morning, once in the evening, repeated every day. And that would be enough to bring about enormous amounts of change in the whole nature. You can actually radically reshape even your character and your personality in this way. So this is the culmination of our chapter on concentration. And the next chapter, which we will take up next Friday, is renunciation, which he describes as the left arm of the yoga, where purification and concentration are the right arm. So again, you see this polarity. The purification and concentration are things you have to do to get an effort to attain, whereas renunciation is what you have to let go, disengage from. So that's the left arm as opposed to the right arm. And they assist each other. I think we can pause here and take up any questions or anything you want to share.
For example, one does this work of the inner transformation as an aspect. Is it normal that there are kind of rebellions against that?
Yes. Inevitably, there will be rebellions. So the question will be asked, who wants to change? Observe in yourself. Often, even within the mind, there are two parts. Especially the things which you really like to do, which you don't want to give up, but which you think you're required to give up. So there's a part of your mind which will rush to justify not giving it up now, while another part says, no, but I have to eventually. And there's this struggle between different parts. So the question is to be asked, who wants the change? And obviously those parts which are not it who wants the change have a resistance. At the very least, an inertia, at the most, an opposition. The key to making a rapid, all-encompassing change is to find something in you which is connected to it all. And if that part in you wants to change, then all is as if carried with it. Okay? And this is where the psychicization becomes so important. If it is only the mind which wants, even if the mind infuses itself into the body and tries to cajole the body has a different consciousness, different rules and habits, and there's still some resistance. But the psychic is the one part in us which vibrationally can spread through all these mind, life energies, and physical substance. It innately in its vibration has an affinity, familiarity with the divine consciousness, and an aspiration for growth, for evolution, for union with the divine. And so when that influence spreads, you may feel it almost like a glow, like a light, or a substance like a gas, a melting feeling of a quietness, stillness, purity, joy, sacredness, consecration, aspiration, but which fills the whole being. Be careful consciously to feel it in the body substance, in the life energies, in the emotions, in your mind awareness, and let it permeate all these parts. And then as it fills all those parts, wherever it has touched, wherever it has filled, gradually, automatically, there's a kind of a loosening up of all these resistances and knots. And then when the center of the mind will turns in aspiration or wills something, those same parts now, it's as if soil which has been softened with water, it's soft clay, it shapes more easily, the resistance is much less. But if gradually the filling of this has even awakened within you a clear sense of the psychic center, and from there the decision comes, from there the will, with the alliance of the mind's will, from there it comes, then all these parts joyously turn. And it's as if the main resistance of human nature is overcome. This is the passage most helpful for the process of transformation in the integral yoga. Of course, before this happens sufficiently, the other parts may still function, the mind will can act, opening to higher things, sending light and force will even prepare those parts to receive the psychic influence and so on. So all these things can go parallelly, but that is the thing which diffuses all opposition in nature. I will conclude with one incident narrated by an old sadhika who came here in 1937, I think, at the age of 18. So she was told this by another sadhak who was already there for 10 years before her. So he came in those early years before Sri Aurobindo had shifted to his current room in the ashram main building. He was staying where now there is the stamp collection room. So when the sadhaka came, he met Sri Aurobindo, wanted to be accepted as his disciple. Sri Aurobindo asked him a few questions first, asking what kind of practices he had done before. And then he said, though there is no formal initiation, you are accepted. And then he walked over to the window and looked out. And there below in the courtyard, the same place we go to where the samadhi is there and all the pots, there were some empty pots in which they would grow flowers, but the pots were empty, they had been washed, they had been kept in the sun to dry. So he called the sadhaka to the window and pointed to those pots and said, you must make yourself like that, empty and open to the sunlight. So he said, remain open all the time to receive the force. And at that time, because Sri Aurobindo himself was directly acting on each of the sadhaks on a very personal level, the basic practice given was this, that you had to remain constantly open to his force and his light. Today we would translate that in a slightly modified vocabulary and say to remain always open to the Divine Mother, to the Shakti, to her force and light, who is nothing but his power, his Shakti. But the condition is very suggestive, and you can actually imprint this feeling into your consciousness, in your mind, like an empty bowl turning, and then the whole body consciousness similarly, empty bowl opening and receiving. In fact, this is the form in which we experience the action of the Divine Shakti in the chakras, in the integral yoga. There is no willed opening of chakras, but when the consciousness of the chakras awakens, one feels the chakras opening like this and receiving the light and force of the Divine Shakti, receiving her and allowing her to settle and establish her station in each of the chakras, generally felt top down. But the focus is not on the chakras, but on the planes of the consciousness, on the levels of our being. And so the whole plane, the whole level opens like this to receive. And we may even make this into a form of meditation where we begin from above and as if layer by layer of petals opening, each part, each layer of consciousness just opens like this and receiving her force and her light to fill, to settle, and to form herself and her rule into all of us so that we may be recast in the mold of the divine. We'll continue the text next Friday.